Today we're doing a video on my personal preferences, what therapeutic approaches I like, and also sharing with you my experiences with the therapists that have helped me over the years. There's about 5 of them. The idea is to define clearly what I like, what works for me, in the hope that you'll figure out what resonates with you, and also help you define, well, if this is, I don't like that bit, and it will help you define what might work for you. So I'm not pushing forward any model that works for everybody. I don't believe that there are any approaches that work for everybody. Now, I've already done a separate video on my impressions, personal impressions as a psychologist of the models that are out there for the past 100 years. And it includes why is it tricky to find a good therapist? Why is it tricky to decide what model? So that's a separate one. Today is more personal. So in terms of personal preferences, an overall view, there are quite a few approaches. For me, at the base of it all is a humanistic approach. And the way I define it for myself is that the therapist is there to provide an open space, a safe space by which I talk, and the most important thing is that I get to hear myself. That's the main thing. And the therapist's position is just to hold the space for me to talk freely and then reflect back. Now, I've already talked in different videos that while the general approach is to create a safe space and not to interfere with the process or interfere with it as least as possible, there are situations where if I say to my therapist that, I'm feeling suicidal, then they would need to check whether I'm at risk to myself, or a risk to others. In my case, I don't have a history of being a risk to others. So within that context, that's the base for me. The base is the humanistic model. And I prefer a therapist who has that base and is choosing different approaches from other models and trying to figure out what might be appropriate, as opposed to a therapist who's sticking to one model. Now that can work for others. Just take one approach and try to fit the client to the model, so to speak. That works for some people, but for me it doesn't. I'm literally looking for that base that I just talked about, and then as many different approaches that feel appropriate. And the world of psychology and psychiatry and social work and art is generally expanding. For example, 20 years ago, we started to talk more about body approaches, right, with the recognition that for trauma, talk therapy is not enough. So I've educated myself as much as possible to various approaches that are out there, and thinking back to the classical approaches, for example, from psychoanalytic, the Freudian and the post-Freudians, what I would take, what I really like, what resonates with me is the defense mechanisms. Now, I'm not going to get into each one of these. I'm just going to name them, and I leave it to you to explore it and discover it. So from the psychoanalytic, I'm taking the defense mechanisms, and not so much the other approaches of looking at how the inner world is structured and all of these theories. I'm leaving those behind, although I did get into it at one time. From Jung, Carl Jung, I love the archetypes. I love the idea of the collective unconscious, although it took me a long time to just get a sense of what it is. I like some of the concepts that were inspired by Eastern philosophies, like synchronicity. Um, and I dip in and out of these models. You know, I find myself getting into Jung for a while and then getting some books, and then going to something else and coming back to it. So it's not a linear process. It's a matter of taking things from here and there, and let them, all of these ideas, be internalized until they become intuitive. So in doing this video, I had to remind myself of what I have been influenced by. For example, one of the things I like is cognitive behavioral, and not so much behaviorism, because when I was undergraduate, we had, you know, a course on behaviorism, and, you know, we're given, each person in class was given a mouse to train, and I didn't like that, you know. So somehow in my head, you know, I kind of, when I was writing a list of the things that I've been influenced by, I didn't put down behaviorism. Until recently, I was thinking about an intervention that I applied on myself, and it was pure behaviorism. It wasn't cognitive behavior, it was just pure behaviorism. You know, so just to emphasize that over time we absorb approaches, and we're not necessarily conscious of what we're applying to ourselves. Besides those, there's the body therapies and somatic work, and that's a huge field, which I talk about in another video. Okay, so in terms of defining the general qualities that I like in a therapist, for me the most important aspect is the relationship. Meaning that it's different than the medical model, where you are a patient and you're going to the therapist and there's a clinical distance, and you tell them what your symptoms are, what you're concerned about, and they take a view of assessing you from a scientific place, and based on their experience, they come up with an intervention. And sometimes there is a distance in the relationship. It's not about developing a relationship. In fact, it's about keeping a distance. Now, that's a generalizing, meaning not every psychiatrist or somebody who's following the medical model, not every practitioner will go that way. For some, they are incorporating different approaches, and for some, they are bringing the humanistic, and for some, the relationship is important. But for me, I'm making a clear distinction of what I like. In my head, I'm very clear. The relationship comes first. So I'm looking for a sense of connection. Eye contact is really important for me. So within that context, the main approach for me is, like I said, in the humanistic model, it's about connecting the client. I'm connecting what's going on in an open space, and try to reveal it rather than to myself first, rather than getting intellectual about it. And actually, I do try to model this in these videos. That's why you see me close my eyes a lot, as opposed to, I could have prepared this very differently. I could have gotten very structured about it and delivered these videos as a lecture, but I'm not doing that. I'm literally trying to give you a sense of what does it feel like for me to access my inner world. Because for me, the inner world is the guide, rather than me trying to engineer how I look at it. And it's not a matter of me trying to control my inner world. It's a matter of opening up and see what comes up. So with that, I'm very cautious of any therapist who has a theoretical model that they're trying to fit me in. That's why the humanistic model emerged. It emerged, as far as I'm concerned, as a reaction to scientific, well, quite often they're not really scientific. Quite often the models that came before the humanistic model is theorizing. And sometimes the author is so charismatic and such a good writer, and they write with this authority that they're giving you truth. And there for me is the same problem that we have with religion, which is what the scientific model was trying to get away from. So in practical terms, I'm trying to reveal an inner world to myself, and I'm looking for an openness from the therapist. I'm looking for the therapist to have a sense of exploration, of asking me questions of, oh, tell me more about this, rather than assuming what's going on for me. That's so important, because if they have their own theory and they're trying to fit me into it, they're going to be skewing the process. They're going to be skewing this unraveling, this opening, and that would really piss me off. So I'm looking for open-ended questions rather than directive questions. And I'm looking for the therapist not to be clever, not to be asking questions for them to prove that they got me. I'm looking for openness. I'm looking for both of us to be lost and to be comfortable in being lost, because one of the unfortunate pressures on professionals in the classical scientific models is that they get training, they get paid, and they're in a professional position of knowing what's going on. Now, some clients need that. Some clients need to take themselves to a professional. They're not particularly interested in learning about these different models that are out there. They're not interested in taking charge of their own life. In the same way that if I had a medical problem today, personally, I would, if I had a biological problem, like say digestion problems or problems breathing, personally, I'm not interested in researching biological issues and then trying to solve that problem. I actually would go to a medical doctor. I would try to inform myself a little bit. I might take a second opinion, but in general, I am handing myself over to a doctor and falling into the scientific model. But when it comes to therapy, it's different for me. I'm taking charge. I want to educate as much as myself. I want to educate myself as much as possible. I want to have a direct relationship with my inner world. And I don't want anybody to interfere with that. I want somebody to support it, but not interfere with it. I want somebody to introduce me to different models, introduce me to different ways of looking at things internally, but not push it. So that's a huge difference. They're not taking charge. They're saying, you know what you're saying reminds me, what about this, what about that? But they're coming from the place of they don't know 100% what's right for me. That's the kind of openness that I'm looking for, because it's really about honoring that my inner world is the guide. It knows best what it needs. Again, all of this is really just specific to me, to my history and my life. If I had problems with impulse control, if I had psychotic tendencies, if I have a tendency to go into delusional states, I wouldn't be taking this approach. I would be taking another approach. But in the last 40 years, I've taken it into myself for it to be my responsibility 100%. This is my life, and I'm committed to learning about the inner world and educating myself as much as possible. But I am the one who is in charge, and I'm the one who's responsible for honoring the inner world, you know. So in practical terms, I'm looking for somebody who's asking open-ended questions, like I said, and not trying to guess and be clever. It's a collaborative effort. Okay, so this is a really important aspect for me, and I need the therapist to have been in therapy. And I was actually shocked when I was, started working in the health board in Ireland, that there are therapists who haven't been in therapy. And really, there was a big division between counseling psychology and clinical psychology, and it was just, counseling psychology was only beginning to find its place. I don't really know how things are today, because for the past 20 years I haven't been involved in any health systems. But I guess Ireland is not the issue. It's a global issue, and it really depends on what your training has been. And like I said, there are no clear-cut, strict divisions between psychiatry and psychotherapy. You will find psychiatrists who are interested in bringing in humanistic ways of working. There are psychiatrists who are in therapy. But here's how I look at it, and here's why it's so important to me. I've explained in the other video some of the intricacies of applying a scientific approach to certain models. The question of science and to what extent can you measure and all of that, that's a big area out there. But for me personally, the way I look at it, it's closer to art than to science. That could mean anything, and that could easily be misinterpreted. So I don't know what to do here, but for now, what I'm looking for, I perhaps can explain it more in metaphor. It's a bit like me wanting to play music and learn an instrument, which includes the voice, and going to a music teacher who knows theory but doesn't play an instrument. Personally, I need a music teacher to play an instrument. End of story. Now, that actually doesn't mean that technically it's not possible to have a music teacher who doesn't play an instrument but knows theory and listens to music and is passionate about it. And it's actually, on a human level, it is possible to get help and to get guidance, because, like I've said before, having an education does not guarantee that you're going to be good or good for me. And like any other area, you have also, any field is going to be led by human beings. Human beings by nature, you'll get delusional states, you'll get somebody over-identified with their approach, thinking it will solve the world. You'll get corruption, unlike any other field. So back to the analogy, I'm looking for somebody who plays an instrument and has struggled with playing an instrument, because the struggle and working on their personal struggle is where the richness is for me. And to take another analogy, I don't want guidance on my relationship with my wife from a religious person who has never been in a relationship. While I might respect their ideologies and I might expect, macro concepts of love and listening and all of that, the reality is when you try to apply listening and goodness and all of that, it's fucking messy, and this is the point of doing all of these videos, to move away from the literature that is out there, that is theoretical, that is generalizing, that can look neat on paper. And this is what I've introduced to myself to when I was an undergraduate. And my personal experience is that at the time I wanted the writer to share personal experience, not just generalize. So that's why I need a therapist to have struggled from a personal experience, and I would feel it. I remember when I worked with victims of torture, and I worked with clients who come from war-torn countries, and when I tell them I come from Lebanon, there is an ease. They ease up. It's like this guy knows darkness in a different level from a therapist who has grown up very comfortably. Now, again, I am not excluding therapists who haven't grown up in war-torn countries. I don't necessarily need a therapist who grown in war-torn countries. So these are just generalizations. I guess that's what's one of the difficult things about this area. I'm trying to find what works for me. I have these general concepts to guide me, but there are always exceptions, For now, that's enough in terms of naming what I'm looking for. And I'll let some more of the details come out from the personal experience that I will share with you with the different therapists that I had. And again, let clarifications come out organically. We take a break? Okay, so here I'm gonna share my experiences with different therapists. And I just realized something, that my first contact with the helping profession, at the age of 13, I had this spiritual experience uninvited. I wasn't part of any spiritual or religious practice, but I had this experience where I talk about it in another video, where I felt this. I was praying, but I felt this sense of chest, like what they call an opening of the heart in Sufism. And for the next 2 months, I felt like my sense of self dissolved, and I felt this compassion towards the whole world and sharpness and intellect. And that lasted for 2 months. And then there was certain, I think, nervous system collapse. And I got hepatitis, I don't know which kind, but the easy kind, the one that I managed to come out of it in 3 weeks. And for those 2 months, I had very sharp intellect. And then when I had the hepatitis and I came out of it, I have not only lost that sharpness, but I ended up in a state of fog. And that was the beginning of depression. And I had taken, we went to the doctor, or we took a blood test, and it's like, okay, he doesn't have any hepatitis anymore. But after a few weeks of being so frustrated that I didn't get even my original concentration, out of my own pocket money that I have saved up, I went to get another blood test. I didn't even tell my grandmother at the time. And I went, took a blood test, and I said to the guy, I don't know if he was a doctor, but I said to him, I can't concentrate, He said, like, why are you coming to me? We already have a blood test. And I said, because I can't concentrate. And his reaction was like, if you don't want to study, don't blame it on your blood, that kind of thing. And I mean, that really took me back, because I was searching, I was struggling. It's not like out of my pocket money, I'm paying him. It's not like I didn't want to study. And when I told my grandmother, she gave me the money back, it was a lot of money that I have saved up. So, that's an experience of young teenager not being heard. And I don't know how, I guess he doesn't see me as a person. I don't know how you want to frame it. I'm sharing it because I'm guessing a lot of people out there do try to reach out for help, and they got that kind of reaction, and sometimes people shut down. Well, things start getting worse from there. I was 13, and by the time I was growing up in the Civil War in Lebanon, and I would spend the summers in London. Eventually, by the time I finished school and I went to Ireland, I enrolled in medicine. And my head was so messed up. I couldn't concentrate at all. And things just kept on getting worse until, and I shared this in another video, until I took to a blade and I cut across my chest. And I wasn't trying to hurt myself. I was trying to bring myself out of a state of numbness. And as it happened, I was with a friend of mine, and he was doing the washing of the clothes, and he saw that there's blood on my vest, and he kind of contacted my dad's secretary, and she contacted me back and suggested, I don't know how it happened, but I guess I ended up going to the student medical center in Trinity College. And I wanted to get an appointment with the psychiatrist, and the doctor that saw me, I said I was feeling suicidal, and he asked me whether I could wait till next day or wait a couple of days, and that surprised me. And now looking back, it's a very valid question. And I said yes, because I was clear about my impulse control. I was feeling suicidal, but I knew I was not at risk to myself. I was in a lot of pain, but knew I was not going to leave this world. So I met with the psychiatrist a couple of days later, or I don't know, the next day or a couple of days. And like I said, I was doing medicine at the time, and I explained to the psychiatrist my background in the Civil War and all of that personal stuff in relation to mom and dad, and she ended up, well, I don't know which came first, but at a certain point she recommended a medication. And when I went to the chemist, the pharmacy, they kind of looked at me a bit funny, and they gave me a jar of orange pills that looked like an M&M, and it was very cheap. I don't know, it was like €3 or something, or the equivalent of €3 or €4. And I got a sense that she gave me placebo. And next time I saw her, I said, she said, how did it go? And I said, well, I had hope, when I got whatever you prescribed me, but I'm guessing they're placebos. And she said yes. And overall, she didn't recommend I go on medication. She recommended that I take a year off. She says, considering your history, you know, in the Civil War and everything else, and being under pressure to do medicine, she suggested I took a year off. And from that suggestion, I was able to go back to my dad and say, look, she's, you know, the psychiatrist is recommending this. And I think, I mean, my dad was generally a caring person, but I really don't think they would have heard me if I said I wanted to take a year off. It didn't even cross my mind to take a year off. And also by then I figured that I'm interested in psychology and not biology. And I wanted to do psychiatry because it would have given me more flexibility. But what I ended up doing is dropping out of medicine and going back into psychology the next year. But my experiences with this psychiatrist, she had humanity, but she was also very nervous. I just immediately got the sense that she's not comfortable with me. Not as a person. It's not like she feared me or didn't like me, but like she literally didn't feel like she was comfortable listening to somebody in that much emotional distress. I'm not faulting her. And as far as the consultation, it was very good. What she recommended was exactly what I needed. But I'm just naming that this was not an opportunity where she was inviting me to talk with her. She was looking at the overall picture, and my guess is that her style of working is very much in the medical model back then of taking a practical approach, and it wasn't about therapy and counseling. I still look at her, I mean, I do look at her positively. So there is no criticism there. And I don't know if she recommended counseling or not. I don't know whether my dad would have been open to me going to counseling. And at the time, there was no way for me to work and make extra money in order to pay for my own counseling, because I was a Lebanese citizen. I wasn't, you know, it was illegal for me to work, so to speak, you know. So that was that with that person. I actually don't even know her name. I do think of her fondly, and no criticism there. And thank you if you're watching this. Okay, so first experience with my first official therapist. I was 21, and by then I was third year psychology. And I was contacted by my mother that I haven't seen in, I don't know, man, 8 years or whatever. It was a big thing. I ended up having, I do talk about it in another video, where before going to bed I said to myself, may whatever it is upsetting me come out in a dream. And I came out, I woke up screaming, scared that a huge spider was gonna come from the window and eat me. I knew it wasn't true, so it wasn't a psychotic state as such. But the fear was so primal and so in my body that I left the room. It was a small bedsitter, and I couldn't go back for an hour. I was literally shaking with fear. And I ended up telling this to my dad next day. And I mean, my dad, for all his care when it comes to emotional issues, is just not his thing. But at the time he was going out with a girlfriend, Angie, that, you know, I'm still in contact with. They're not, you know, I mean, they broke up, you know, a year afterwards. I don't know, that was 30 years ago. But she was big into therapy, and she did like Jung a lot. And I think it's her influence that I think I said I wanted to go to therapy, and he was okay with that. I don't think he was comfortable with it, but and like I said, I didn't have means to work and pay for therapy for myself. So Rachel, I met her. She was, I think she was, she was in the psychology department, and she might have been recommended by another therapist, which I kind of knew there, who was also teaching, Isolda. So Rachel came recommended, and that's important, And like I said, at the time, I was in the psychology department, so that I was in the right environment. Well, it's not a guarantee, but I felt, looking back, I'm lucky overall that I was doing psychology and I had my certain preferences and I could get advice. I mean, and on that occasion, the advice was right. It worked with Rachel. And I found out pretty soon that she was a new trainee, and I might have been I don't know whether her third client or whatever, but she didn't have a lot of experience. But looking back, that's completely okay. Because Rachel did embody those qualities from the humanistic model, and I think she was planning on in training with Carl Rogers, and then he died. But the main thing from Rachel, looking back, is what I described earlier on about my preferences. There was an open space. She did check whether I'm a danger to myself or not, whether she needed to recommend me to a psychiatrist, and I was not a danger to myself, despite having suicidal feelings. The main thing from Rachel, looking back now, is remember telling her about growing up in the Civil War and my history with mom and dad and all of that. And I remember her saying something to the effect of, well, what would happen if you just allow yourself to feel? And I intuitively just said, well, I could end up crying for 3 days in a row. I recognized that I was sitting on a lot of history. And she says, well, what's wrong with that? And that idea was completely new to me, to just allow myself to just feel. And there was a lot of, so I took a conscious decision then to allow myself to feel what I was feeling, what I had bottled up till then. And it was a very slow unfolding, and damn, man, was it painful. I forgot how painful it was. Anyway, look, I'm not going to talk so much about what unfolded. But for the purposes of this was a decision for me to go with this unfolding and to bear what was coming up, which was a lot of pain. Unfortunately, that seems to be a principle when it comes to trauma, is the importance of connecting with the pain. I mean, on my head didn't like it then, and it doesn't like it now, but now I accept we as mammals and human beings are wired in a certain way, and the system internally is designed in such a way to bottle up the pain and hide it so you can function and not crack and not take it out on yourself or others. But at the same time, this compression and putting the pain away diminishes who we are, and the process of expanding. I mean, physically now I feel, when I'm thinking about all of this, the process is one of allowing all of that got frozen to unfreeze. And it makes sense why a lot of people don't want to necessarily go to therapy, because they're facing face again, and fuck it, pain was bad enough the first time, you know. So that is a cornerstone, and that is something that I've committed to since then, you know, which is allow unraveling, allow myself to feel the pain. And another thing that came out of the work is, at a certain point, Rachel said to me, you seem to be doing a lot of work on your own outside the session, and the session is supposed to help you contain it, but you seem to be, you know, doing a lot of work on your own. And that is something, yes, you know, and that is something that I have been doing since then. And the dangers of that is frying myself or doing more than is healthy. But there you go. I can talk about it in another video perhaps, but that's how I'm put together. And that's a personal impulse to work on myself so I can get to a place where life feels like it's livable. Remembering how it was being in the sessions, just very vulnerable. Which highlights that I actually felt safe with Rachel. And that's something I'm very grateful for. I don't know how long I worked with her, whether 6 months. I don't think it was, this wasn't years, and I don't remember how we stopped. Overall, I look at that experience, that connection very fondly. And yeah, I don't know what more to say about it, except in general, every therapist that I've went through has, for me, I'm building on the previous therapist's work and everything I've been doing in between, including trying to educate myself about different approaches. And you know, whether I was a psychology student or not, I mean, the field of psychology and the knowledge that I got from being in an educational institution, that material is available out there, you know. So what I'm trying to say is that I did benefit being a psychology undergraduate student, but it also is possible for people to educate themselves about what's out there. My second therapist is Alda, a German lady. Rachel, I haven't been in contact since then, but Isolde ended up being, in my life, I guess. I'll explain in a minute. So I think Isolde did recommend Rachel, and there was even a session when I was working with Rachel where I met both of them at the same time. I think Rachel needed to check something, and Isolde has experience in Gestalt therapy, which I'm quite fond of. Actually, I didn't name Gestalt therapy earlier on. I love Gestalt therapy. Its founder, Fritz Perls, I loved his autobiography, In and Out of the Garbage Pail. Isolde as a person, I mean, we went out for a walk recently, but Isolde has a very unique presence to her. There's a softness from her, and it's almost like she has a connection to a different realm out there. It's like, I don't know how to say this. It's almost like a fairy, and I mean this positively, almost like a fairy zone where she looks at me and there's this smile that sees the wonder of the person. And one of the things that I got from her was this concept of, if you call upon the inner world to help you, and she wasn't defining the inner world by any model out there, but just laying down that principle. If you connect with your inner world and you call upon it to help you, that it would respond to you. And it's funny, like even now getting into that zone of remembering, well, I'm going like that with my hands because shit, I just realized, yeah, look, to a certain extent, when I say inner world, when it comes to Isolde, there is this feeling now, and it's a concept that exists out there, you know, like with Jungian psychology or whatever, that the connection between the inner world and other worlds, and we don't know what they are, we're not trying to define things here, but I guess it's that concept in Jungian psychology that which differs from Freud. For Freud, the unconscious is contained within the individual, whereas Jung, the inner world is connected to something beyond us. And I guess with Isolde, there's that sense. I don't know how clearly it was articulated at the time. I really don't think it was. You know, and it's not important to articulate. I'm just trying to name the vibe that I got from her. And it's a wonderful vibe. I felt held. I felt seen on a spirit level that is beyond my character. You know, it's like she made me believe in a part of myself that I kind of didn't know was there. And it's a part that is still difficult to articulate today, you know, because when I talk about spiritual experiences, it got really messy for me in the last 30 years, including that experience that I had at the age of 13, which I'm still grappling with. Is still not very well integrated. But for the purposes of this video, yeah, with Isolde, I don't remember how long we worked for. Maybe it was in and out. But it's a very unusual situation because at a certain point, she ended up recommended I work with Claire. So, you know, I don't remember how we stopped working together. She might have taken a different job. But what's funny is that at a certain point, years later after I graduated, and that was like years because I came out with 3 masters, and I applied for a job working with adults sexually abused in childhood, and I was working in that center for a while. And then Isolde contacts me and wanted to meet with me, and she said that she was offered a job in that center where I was working. And how did I feel about it? I mean, that's one hell of an unusual and rare situation, and I loved Isolde, and, I guess it was going to be tricky because she knew so much about me, and she became my boss, and which was a completely different role than the one we had, which is open space and all of that. But now I was, for the lack of a better word, an employee of that center, and she had professional responsibilities towards the clients first, and towards the center, and And there was a time when something big came into my life, when I discovered I was infertile, and I was literally shaken as a professional. I wanted to take some time off, so there were issues, I hope she's okay with me saying this, that should be fine. Should I say it? Should I not say it? Yeah, I wanted to take some time off, and she wasn't very keen on that, And then I went to a doctor and I explained the stress I was under, and he kind of gave me, suggested I take a month off, and he gave me I don't know, medical certificate, which means, originally I wanted to take unpaid leave. So I came back to his office and said, look, I saw a doctor, and he gave me, so I ended up getting a paid leave for a month, and she, she was fine with that, but it could have gotten very messy, but it got a bit messy, but not too messy, and later on, I moved from that center, but and then years later, I got my divorce and I got married, and for the second time, and I had a get together, and I invited her and she came, and so she stayed a constant in my life. And like I said, it's an unusual situation, but it was navigated. I still have a lot of love and respect for her, and we've met on and off, and I was conscious not to interact with her as a client, because not to carry that vibe with me of, so we moved towards more of an equal relationship. And we met recently, went for a couple of walks in the last 6 months. I bounced some things from her, more like a colleague to another colleague, so it feels, it feels mature. That's how I'm looking at it, So look, overall, I'm just very fond of not just how she worked with me and what she introduced to me, but the spirit of the person. And, like I said, for me, relationship is number one, and it has that extra quality of not just the qualities of the approach they have, but it has the essence of the individual person. So Claire was recommended by Isolde. By then, I think I was working. I don't remember whether I was still in, finishing my last master's or whatever, or whether I had already started working as a professional in the child and families. No, not in the child, in the Center for Adult Sexually Abused in Childhood. I don't actually remember. So Claire, it's her kindness that I mean, they all had kindness, but Claire had, it's difficult to describe. I had a lot of space, and like I said, it was a continuation of sitting with what's coming up, and I had done a lot of work, and it was fucked up, painful, some of that shit that came out. I remember connecting with an image that came out, a visual from inside, not an intellectual discovery or whatever. And the image about my inner child, or how I was feeling on a deep level, it was image of a baby with no skin. So how can you hold a baby with no skin? How can I hold that image of myself? But it was strong and it came out, and it was very painful, and you just sit with it, you know. And the inner world has its own way of unfolding. It's not a process, like I said, I wasn't following a process of trying to intellectualize my emotions and package them. It was a process of unfolding, and that never stops. You know, it shifts, but doesn't stop. It shifts in the sense that that image of the baby with no skin, now the baby is no longer a baby, and it has skin, and it's happier, and it has levels, different levels of integrating. I do feel more of an adult today, imagery wise, and what's coming up. But I'm just naming that the process can be extremely painful, and I stayed committed to the process. I'm glad I did, and you know, yeah, there's no way around this pain thing, you know. If I'm gonna try to be open to what's in there, stuff is gonna come out, and I don't know what's coming out. I don't remember how long I've worked with Rachel. No, not Rachel. God, okay, they were getting mixed up now with Claire. I'm really getting jumbled now. I don't remember how long I've worked with Claire, but there's another thing that came out which, in context, it surprised me at the time. I share in a different video about my history, you know, how my dad took us away from our mom, and then our grandmother adopted us legally. But there's always that sense with my grandmother that she's not our mother and she's doing us a favor, although she wasn't saying, she never said that. But I do remember, you know, when I was very young, at the age of 5, you know, there were a couple of occasions where I guess we drove her nuts, and she said she was going to ring our dad and tell him to come and take us away. It was only a couple of incidents, and I don't feel any resentment towards her, because I do understand, and I did understand back then, the pressure she was under. So it's not like I felt rejected by her in any way. I felt very loved by my grandmother. But those 2 times where she said, I'm going to ring your dad, is when I realized I am not really her son. You know, and she doesn't have to be doing this. And I remember only calling her mother once, and it didn't feel right. So with Claire, something came up, which is I asked her whether she could adopt me spiritually. And I don't even know back then what that meant, but I felt strongly about it. And I said it to her, and she said she was going to think about it. And she came back, you know, well, not she came back in the following session. She said she thought a lot about it, but it didn't feel right to say yes to that. I guess what I was asking for is something on a spiritual level. She did hear it, she did honor it. And that's what's really important, is that she honored the request, thought about it, and said it didn't feel right to do that. And I didn't feel a rejection. Because she has taken it in. And it didn't feel right to her. And she said, what would feel right if I gave her a picture of myself as a young kid? And she would keep that for me. And at a certain session, she actually shared something personal that her son asked her, whose picture is that? I don't remember what she said. I guess the reason I'm sharing all of this is to share with you that I was taking an approach of letting the inner world unfold, let things come out, and go with them even if they didn't make sense to me. And I didn't get a sense that this was a big ask from Claire. And I guess, you know, now that I'm talking about it, I guess it would make sense for me to have felt rejected, but I didn't. And I'm glad she said no, because it left me, well, first of all, I guess the relationship was so strong and I felt enough care from her and seen enough that that's what's healing, you know. And whatever vibe has been developing between us, with her bringing in her humanity, is what made it, I guess, possible for me not to feel rejected and for me to take on, well, I guess that's not going to happen. It leaves it up for me to parent myself. Yeah, I guess I don't need to say more about it. I'm just sharing the vulnerabilities and the intricacies of that approach that I am personally taking, and that's not necessarily an approach that I'm recommending for somebody else to take. Another thing which was very significant is, this is the third thing, is that when I graduated from Trinity College with 3 masters, and I was feeling like I've betrayed myself for forcing myself to stay in a system that I didn't like, you know, and I have a lot of issues with educational systems in general. And I guess one of the things which was so strong for me when I graduated is that I said, you know, I felt, oh God. Look, without getting it too much into it, I can talk about it in some other video. I felt a sense of humiliation for coming out with 3 masters, and a part of me was like, well, where is the real you, or some whatever, you know. And I remember talking to this jazz musician, a legend, Joe Henderson, in New York between the gigs, and he was saying he still practices, and I wanted to do something which finishes, you know, as opposed to the musical world where you're only working on it. So I started, I started writing books, you know. By the time I saw Claire, I'd written 9 books. The purpose wasn't to publish, although I did publish. But I remember the 9th book was about growing up in the Civil War in fictional form. And I had written this book, and I asked Claire if she would read it. It was a motherfucker of a book. I mean, it was big, you know. And when I published it, I had to split it in 2 books. And she read the whole thing. Wait a minute. Now, I think I actually read it out to her in the sessions. I don't remember. Yeah, I think that's what, I don't remember. But that was very significant. I don't know what more to say about it, or whether even I should, or discuss it in some other video. I guess the point for today is that therapy isn't necessarily just about feelings, but in this case, I did something that is artistic, that is about working through my history, and this occasion, not the personal history, but the collective, of what I was growing up with this, which is the Civil War, and the artistic process of writing was therapeutic, and it still is therapeutic, and that is part of therapy, and you can bring that into therapy, is my point. Looking back, so that's the three main things. And looking back, I don't remember how we stopped working. With each therapist up till then, it was a natural, somehow I guess a natural stopping. I don't know what more to say about it now. Yeah, that's enough for now. I guess, look, all of these videos that I'm doing right at the moment are open to your questions or whatever, and if they feel appropriate, I can do other videos about them. There is one guy therapist that I went to, so up till now there's been 3 women. I don't know whether I saw him before Claire or not, but there was this clinical psychologist that was recommended to me. I think I saw him for 8 sessions. He spent the sessions writing down. Very little eye connection. He had a good vibe, but this thing of writing down for the whole session did not work for me. There was nothing about his approach that was off or inappropriate, but it just was not for me. I got a sense that he was seeing a lot of clients during the day, so this was not about developing a relationship, and this was not about a connection. To some level, at a certain extent, I feel like I was being put in a jar among other jars. I don't have hard feelings about him. It's just that's not for me. Yeah, I guess it helped me define what's for me and what's not. And like I said, there is no negativity there. At some point after Claire, at some point I started to get into going beyond mainstream psychology and exploring spiritual work, and I ended up seeing Maria. Maria Rollins is not a psychotherapist. She's a Reiki healer. I'm kind of including her here, despite that it's outside the realm of classical counseling, because she had, I don't know what to call it, but supernatural abilities to a certain extent. I would give her somebody's name and she can tell me a lot about him, but I'm including her here because I saw her for nearly 20 years. And most of the contact did involve what I would describe as her hearing me out. And I guess she helped me on a spiritual level, because this was when I was going through, infertility, and then later on, difficulties in the marriage, and then the breakup, and then the legalities, and that got really ugly. And she helped me avoid becoming bitter. So what I would name here is that she helped me polish my heart, and introduced me to prayer, even though I don't have any religious systems that I follow, and that's something I've talked about in some other videos. So I am including her because I'm sharing with you that I want beyond mainstream psychology and therapy, and I still have some contact with Maria, and I look at her very positively, Thank you, Maria. Thank you to everybody. I did have an experience that went very messy with the therapist, but I'm not going to discuss it here because it's too messy to kind of, and so unusual, so whatever I've learned from that, actually it's too messy to share at the time being. But I'm just naming that despite me having a lot of good experience as a therapist, and despite being very well informed in the field, it's still a risk. You know, it did mess me up, but at the same time, I don't have any regrets about it because I've learned a lot from it. So, John. John I've been seeing for the past, I don't know, 7-8 years. He also came recommended, and I'm still seeing John. And John is younger than me, not by hugely, I don't know, 8-10 years. And so with John is still, I've been seeing him regularly for the past 7-8 years. And I saw him during some very difficult times in relation to my daughter, or was worried about her, or there wasn't much contact with her, and in the thick of legal situations that were taking years to sort out. So some of the main things that I got from John, again, John falls into all the principles that I love about therapy, which is open-ended space, the humanistic model, but he has extra stuff. And the extra stuff is the following, if I can be concise about it. One is reintroducing me or suggesting that I look at certain personality disorders, like narcissistic personality disorder, in relation to some people in my life that were affecting me. And he says, look, I know you are a guy who likes to come from the heart and just connect with people. And said, but there are, I want you to consider that there are some people in your life who would fit well into seeing them separately than in the usual way they like to interact with people, because they have certain traits and approaches that pry on your openness. So I did look into this area, so I'm kind of more back into psychology, in a different way that I had been approaching things up till now. That's one, and that's a big area. I can talk about it some other time. The second thing is that he was working in a college, and he was in contact with young female students, and he had experiences with young girls who were experiencing the same, parallels to what I was dealing with in relation to my daughter and not seeing her. And that was great, because it's a very specific type of experience, and I've learned a lot from that. And he helped me navigate my relationship with my daughter. That is so important. There's a couple of things which I kind of should have included in the beginning, but I don't know what happened to the notes. They are there, which is that I cannot see how I would have gotten here today without the therapy help that I've gotten all along. And for me, the way I look at it is, we have defense mechanisms internally that are designed for us not to get in touch with the pain. We can try to get in touch with the pain, but when doing that work alone is very difficult. So my metaphor is that it's the same as, no matter how good a dentist is, they need to go to another dentist. And if a dentist is trying to work on themselves, no matter how skilled they are, if their hands touches the nerve, it's going to shake their hands, and it's going to, the skills that they have of precision, it's going to be shaken. So that's the metaphor that I have. That's why it's important for me to have sought help. The third area that John helped me a lot with, and still does, is the area of biology. To look at myself as a mammal, and the areas that I've ignored when I was an undergraduate, which is evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, which I was dismissing at the time because I was interested in psychic work. So he helped me educate myself in the field of the nervous system, and contextualize trauma in the specific area of trauma. So what I would say is that he's trauma informed. And so the fourth thing is that not just biology, but the specific area of trauma and the term complex trauma, and all that it entails. And it's a big field that has been growing recently. And you can find books on complex trauma that you wouldn't have found 30 years ago, So generally, the work is very slow and steady, and I really like that. And I guess he's been providing a holding space. And all the things that I said earlier on about the therapist asking open-ended questions, that's what I love about John. Is that he's asking questions from a place of curiosity, from a place internally in him. He is listening to me beyond just intellect, using himself, his body, his sensations, his sensory intuitive input, and excuse me, asking questions that are exploratory. So he's not trying to guess what's going on for me. He's trying to, there's a concept which I should have shared earlier on, which is one of the things that I don't like about somebody trying to guess my inner world, because I want the therapist to recognize that they can't know what's going on inside of me. The metaphor that I have is that I'm going to dive deep inside and I'm going to try to stay in contact with them, and they can't see what I'm seeing, and I can't even see what I'm seeing clearly either. That's why I don't want somebody to assume what's going on. I want somebody to stay connected with me where I am lost, they are lost too. But we're using our experiences to stay in touch and trying to figure out what's happening. Because the danger of somebody assuming what's going on for me is it leads me to their framework, whereas I need to stay open to what's going on so I can see more. And that's what I love about John. It's exploratory questions. And that's what creates a sense of being seen. And it's an honoring of my inner world. It's an honoring of a 30-year, at least on my behalf, of a commitment to a specific process. And we're both in line with that approach, because that's the approach he is taking with himself. That's how he has dealt with himself in his own therapy. And one of the great things about John is that he shares his own personal experience in an appropriate way in the context of complex trauma. I guess there's a lot I can say about working with John, because, by the way, John Scheunhage, I asked him, would you like me to say his name? And he said yes. And, and I was like, well, if I get, if your name becomes famous and you see a lot of clients, you need to leave me a space, dude. I can say a lot because it's so long and so steady, and this is the longest time. And I also see him sometimes more than once a week. And sometimes, we can go over the hour and a half, and it's an hour and a half with John, by the way. I guess the last thing I want to say is, it feels more like a colleague to colleague. The nature of the work is different than when I was first working with Rachel and Claire and Isolde. It feels more supportive. What's really important is that overall it's actually quite light, and there's a sense of a friendship. There's a sense of two colleagues working. on one colleague, and there's a lot of fun between us. At this stage, we're messing with each other. Sometimes I'm tricking into something, or he's tricking me. So there is a certain lightness, despite the overall many messiness and intricacies of this work. I think that's enough for now. Yeah, I think that's enough for now. And like I said, I'm open to doing other videos, taking small little bits and exploring them further. There is, like I said, there is one therapist which it got very messy with, but overall, it's been wonderful, and wonderful. And I feel very lucky and privileged to be able to afford this, to have the time and to have the interest. But it is a path, and I'm committed to that path. And my stomach is rumbling. It has something to say. But anyway, look, let's stop here. That's probably enough for now.